This committee has long directed NASA to return humans to the moon and eventually Mars. NASA announced the delay of Artemis 2 to September 2025 and Artemis 3 to September 2026.
Thank you. That's a little bit embarrassing, I'll admit. NASA's long-term goal is to send humans to Mars.
Yes, I was 9 years old that summer, too. You know exactly how many relatives you have based on what you've said on the phone.
If you want to consider somebody who's a pilot and a physician and maybe a congressman going on one of those missions, just let me know.
We can't partner with people with an empty bag.
Even though contractors were behind schedule and over cost, NASA was still paying them overly generous performance awards.
It would be fascinating watching you use a slide ruler.
I possibly should retire from the field.
This committee has long directed NASA to return humans to the moon and eventually Mars. But this committee's support of Artemis means asking detailed questions of NASA and providing oversight of the agency's proposals. Congress must have proper insight into the agency's planning and execution of this mission to ensure its success. This also means listening to inputs from external stakeholders and hearing differing viewpoints, which is why we've assembled a panel of witnesses with a variety of perspectives today. Last week, NASA announced the delay of Artemis 2 to September 2025 and Artemis 3 to September 2026. I look forward to hearing from NASA about the cause of these delays and potential impacts to future missions and about the steps it is taking to mitigate future risks.
On Artemis 2, NASA astronauts Reed Weissman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen will journey beyond low Earth orbit and around the moon, the farthest humans have journeyed into space in more than 50 years. Approximately 1 year after Artemis 2, the Artemis 3 crew will land on the lunar South Pole and begin building out a robust long-term exploration program. With Artemis 4, astronauts will again visit the lunar surface and start assembly of the space station in lunar orbit called Gateway. NASA's plan for a successful and sustainable return to the moon requires the development of several new space systems, including the SLS rocket, the Orion spacecraft, the Exploration Ground Systems, lunar landers, the Gateway space station, and new lunar spacesuits and lunar rovers. Artemis 3 will build on the progress of Artemis 1 and 2 and adds a commercial lunar lander and advanced spacesuits for walking on the lunar surface. In 2026, Artemis 3 will send humans back to the surface of the moon. While sending humans back to the moon will be a significant accomplishment, we do not intend to stop there. NASA's long-term goal is to send humans to Mars, and the moon will help us get there.
After more than a decade of preparation and delays, NASA successfully completed the Artemis 1 mission in December of 2022. Despite this achievement, NASA faces additional challenges to meeting its Artemis goals. Of utmost importance is resolving technical issues that could threaten astronaut safety. The agency will need to do this while also addressing long-standing concerns, such as unsustainable costs, unreliable project schedules, and the lack of transparency into funding needs. In terms of technical challenges, NASA's most immediate issue is preparing for the Artemis 2 mission, the first crewed test flight of SLS and Orion. For example, the Artemis 1 flight revealed unexpected erosion of protective material on Orion's heat shield. In addition, the agency has identified other issues with Orion that it needs to correct before the next launch. NASA has not developed a comprehensive estimate for all Artemis costs, and unlike its other major projects and programs, NASA has not established life cycle costs or made cost and schedule commitments for some programs supporting Artemis. Without the agency fully accounting for and accurately reporting the overall cost of current and future missions, it will be difficult for Congress to make informed decisions about NASA's long-term funding needs.
And during the testing of some of those systems, we identified an issue with the digital motor controller that has impacted our ability to be able to continue processing the vehicle as previously planned. The additional time that we have given ourselves in the adjusted schedule permits us the opportunity to address the challenges that we've seen with that digital motor controller.
Artemis 3 is more complicated, so there's not a lot of time, and as you saw with Artemis 1, there are things that are going to happen that you need to learn, that you need to investigate. 1 year is not a lot of time to do that learning, turn around and be ready for a September 2026 launch date. So that's the one schedule pressure that we see with the new dates.
So, Ms. Koerner, could you speak to what returning to the moon and eventually going to Mars will mean for the science and technology of tomorrow?
Yeah, if you'll permit me an analogy. So I was here, by the way, and watched Apollo 11 astronauts walk on the moon. So I remember that, and I remember the inspiration that was to me and to those from my generation. The analogy that I'll use for you is, right, a car today and a car from the early 1900s look pretty similar in some regards. They have a steering wheel, they have wheels, they transport people, any number of people depending on the design. But when you look inside the engine, they're very different. They're very different machines. The technology that we're going to the moon with this time is very different. And the technologies that we're developing are actually developing entire industries to support those technologies.
To allow a situation to develop where the human frontier is populated by our adversary and we are not there should be unacceptable to this nation and to our Western and Asian partners. It should be unacceptable. We are not on a path to recognize that. The rest of the world looks and will always look to the nations that occupy the frontier and exploit the frontier and extend the frontier as leaders of the world. By returning to the moon in a focused and expeditious manner, which we are not today, we will inevitably bring along, we will be required to bring along communications and navigation and other infrastructure systems, which we expect others will use as well. By that mechanism, we will have established the standards, just as we did with the ICAO starting at the end of World War II for global air transport.
Ms. Koerner, if you can outline efforts that NASA is making to explain why this matters to America. And by the way, I concur in the chairman's comment that the administrator has huge confidence in you. So if you could answer that.
Thank you. That's a little bit embarrassing, I'll admit. But I'll say one of the efforts that we have done within our agency within the last couple of years really focus on the why of exploration. And we identified 3 pillars associated with that why: science, national posture, and inspiration. Science, I think, is obvious. It's the engine that generates economic benefit wherever it goes, and in addition to inspiring the next generation of STEM, as well as teachers and those of us who look to the scientific discovery with wonder and decide that is something I want to learn more about and want to pursue. Additionally, national posture, I think we've spoken to that a little bit already with Dr. Griffin's testimony, but I'll state we believe, and our administrators spoke about it just last week, that we will be on the surface of the moon before China is. And it's our intent for that to happen.
Before I turn to my next colleague for questions, I would note, since it's true confession time, yes, I was 9 years old that summer too. But in my part of rural Oklahoma, we had one television station, we only had AM radio, and this strange concept called party lines for a phone system.
I remember those.
You know exactly how many relatives you have based on what you've said on the phone. That said, I turn to the gentleman, Mr. McCormick, for 5 minutes.
Is NASA aware of the work that the VA, and this is an obscure question, so I understand I'm probably talking outside the normal purview, but is NASA aware of this study between the VA and Walter Reed addressing mitochondrial dysfunction? And would they be willing to work towards advancing technology to help these astronauts protect their energy cells, if you will?
So you may or may not know this about me, but one of the interesting career parts of my career path is that I spent 5 years running the Human Health and Performance Directorate at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. As an engineer running a health and medical organization, I found it very fascinating, and I learned a lot of things about human physiology and how very little we actually understand about how the human system responds in a microgravity environment. And we today do not understand how the human system would respond in microgravity, followed by partial gravity, back to microgravity. The longest duration crew member that we have just recently returned last year, and he only spent 371 days in space. When we go to Mars, we're going to have to spend close to 1,000 days in space. That transferring of that technology and that information has made great strides in a number of medical fields. You can find equipment that we use for treating astronauts in an emergency room anywhere in the United States and around the world. So we do actually partner with them and with others, and I would welcome further conversation on that and putting you in touch with some of the folks that we have that do that work on a regular basis.
I think that's amazing. As a matter of fact, if you want to consider somebody who's a pilot and a physician and maybe a congressman going on one of those missions, just let me know.
The way we effectively partner with other countries is to establish that we are going to do great things and that there is room for everybody of like mind to join us. We can't partner with people. We can't partner with people with an empty bag. Okay, we have to be clearly seen to be doing things in an efficient, expeditious, focused, determined way. And when that happens, partners will appear.
So as I mentioned earlier, we are in production on not only Artemis 2, but Artemis 3, Artemis 4, Artemis 5. We have hardware and builds for all of those missions at various stages, right? So consistency in budget helps us be able to keep the cadence of those missions to where we can keep our team fresh and keep our team active and have them be able to actually produce the hardware in a timely fashion.
In my experience in both DoD and NASA, multiple occasions over the years, it's not so much a flat budget that is a problem. Actually, most of the time I would welcome a flat budget if I knew I was going to have it. It needs to be at an appropriate level to accomplish the task at hand, but flatness in itself is not the issue. The issue is that when we do not have an appropriation on time, year after year, we force the government actually does very little work itself. It may plan and may integrate work, but the work is done by American industry and in some cases our partner industries. And when we stop and start that funding by delaying or even skipping our appropriation cycles as we did in 2008, that is a huge problem.
Over a decade ago, almost 2 decades ago now, Elon Musk began telling us here on the Capitol and around the country, anywhere someone would listen, that the United States was getting ripped off. That in fact, it shouldn't cost more and take longer to take the same basic rocket and drive the same number of pounds into space. Until he got through the almost infinite blockade by the established launch people, nothing happened. Today we are launching, and in theory we're launching for less. But I guess my question is, whatever happened to fixed, firm, and fair? Whatever happened to that? I think the question primarily for the IG is there any reason that these contracts, particularly to go to the moon and circle it, weren't done on a tell us what it'll cost half a century after you already did it?
Thank you, Mr. Isis. We've previously reported, NASA's been challenged to establish credible costs and schedule estimates. While certainly appropriate.
And they haven't met that challenge. Is that more or less correct?
To date, in the way that we would say is most transparent, that is correct. I think while it's certainly appropriate to have commercial partners involved in the launch activities, a key challenge that we continue to remind the agency is important to hold them accountable for delivering the promised goods and services at the promised price. We've previously reported that at times, even though contractors were behind schedule and over costs, NASA was still paying them overly generous performance awards. And so I think, again, this is less about like the who and more about just making sure that you hold them accountable for delivering at the price they promised.
What should we demand that NASA do in order to deliver the rest of Artemis 2 and 3 on time and with no greater overruns than we've already experienced? What would be the steps that Congress would be required to take?
In my view, one would be locking the agency down into making life cycle costs and schedule commitments. We understand that the world is complex, things will change, but it's incredibly important for Congress to at least have an initial idea of what this is going to cost and when NASA can get it done.
I thank you. The questions could go on again and again, but I probably really would have to bring a slide rule if I were going to calculate all the overruns. So with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
It would be fascinating watching you use a slide ruler.
I've got a whole bunch in my collection if you want me to
Not a
bring
doubt
them
in my mind, not a doubt at all in my mind.
So part of our charter is also to develop a economic engine that generates and stimulates activity in the space sector. And so what we have been doing with the Commercial Lunar Payloads Services contract, we call it CLIPS, I think you refer to it as CLPS.
Oh, like CLIPS.
CLIPS
I'll do that one next.
CLIPS is the way we refer to that, is one of those opportunities to help spur on the development of new space entrants. We know that there's a lot of space industry in the big names that have been out there for years, and they do contribute tremendously to the Artemis program. But we want to also make the entrance bar lower so that we can more broadly generate economic activity across the board.
What are the consequences for contractors if they don't meet the milestones by the assigned deadline?
So again, it depends on the type of contract, right, that we have. When we have performance awards that we can decrement as associated with not meeting milestones. For firm fixed price contracts, it depends again on the way the contract's written. They have to perform, and in some cases we have penalties if they perform. They have to reimburse the U.S. government for the cost. And by reimburse, I say it basically decrements the payment that they would get in that milestone payment. So they may not, for example, get all of a milestone payment if they don't meet in a timely fashion. So a lot of times when we award these, especially the firm fixed price contracts, the contractor will propose to the U.S. government what they would like to see in the milestones. And as part of the negotiation before we even award that contract, we will adjust those milestones, both the values but the timing of them also, in order to make sure that it meets the timeline that we need for whatever it is that contractor is providing.
NASA recently announced a partnership with the UAE on Gateway, under which the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center would provide Gateway's crew and science airlock module, as well as a UAE astronaut to fly to the Lunar Space Station on a future Artemis flight. How will NASA and UAE share cost related to this partnership?
So I don't know that I would say we share costs, right? So when we negotiate with an international partner for a contribution to Artemis or to any activity, there is I'll say, a value that we assess, that we, the U.S. government, assess on what they are contributing. And then in kind, we return a value to them. So for example, the one that you mentioned, the UAE will be providing the airlock. And in exchange, we, NASA, are going to be training a crew member and launching a crew member and giving that country an opportunity to have a crew member on the Gateway space station. So it's more of a value-to-value contribution as opposed to a cost.
They also have a history of partnering with China in lunar efforts. For instance, the same entity has an agreement to include a rover on the Chinese mission to the lunar South Pole. I guess my question is, how, when we are partnering with people who are partnering with others, how do we ensure that the technology shared through a partnership doesn't, shall we say, inadvertently contribute to someone else's space capacities?
So we have a fairly rigorous export control process that monitors and manages our interactions with our international partners at every level to ensure that exactly what you just said does not happen.
I think the first challenge to note was originally NASA designed the spacesuit in-house and then made the decision to contract that out. Which is happening now. As we took a look at some of the current challenges, certainly one has to do with sufficient life support. You need to have backup as you're doing lunar operations, have confidence that the system can operate and sustain the astronauts' life as they go through the mission. So there are some technologies that need to be matured there, some refinements to the requirements that the contractor is working on. That's some of the key things that we pointed to in our recent report.
A spacesuit is like a personal spacecraft, and it's very complex. It has all of the same kinds of systems that a spacecraft would have, but in a much smaller environment. And it has to be, as you noted, adaptable for both male and female of various sizes and shapes. So the design and the development of the hardware for that is something that, while NASA has experience on, we're trying to foster that experience in our commercial industry partners and are helping them.
I would add that if the United States and its international partners have a consistent program to return to the moon and stay, that there are an enormous number of infrastructure development opportunities available in which commercial industry can invest because they know that there will be a return. So I mentioned communications, navigation functions earlier, command and data handling, data storage. The CLIPS program was brought up. There will be a need in supplying a human lunar base for all types of cargo, ranging from small, high-value items to bulk cargo that industry could supply if they know that there is going to be a consistent market for such.
And I think that's an important part, is we're not just going back to the moon, we're going back to the moon to stay on the moon.
I would hope so, although I've been trying for over 30 years to promote such an activity and have so far failed, so I possibly should retire from the field.
No, don't do that. I yield back.
Nobody died going to the moon and back. As a matter of fact, the program that killed most of our astronauts was the cost-saving, redundant use, new and improved shuttle. Ultimately, that program killed the majority of all astronauts that ever died. The early exploration had its death, including 3 on the ground. We learned from that, don't sit in a bag of oxygen on the ground, not able to get off the ship quickly. So there have been lessons. But I've listened for quite a while to this discussion about the spacesuit and what we're going to do, and the discussion as though that women were new to space. I'm sorry, but we've had women in space for longer than some members of Congress have lived now. So I'll ask again. We're looking at overruns and delays, and so I think I'll go to Mr. Russell. When they're putting that figure out there, we've had 2.9% of all those who have gone to space have died. So it's not an insignificant number, but if you take away 2 events of a single program type, you suddenly go from nearly 700 flights and 19 dead to almost nobody in the rest of those flights. So when we're looking at the cost and delivery, are we in fact looking at Artemis looking for new solutions to things which have already been solved? I'm from the generation of the joke about the difference between our inverted writing instrument and the Russians. Okay, and for those who haven't seen it, exactly. We came up with the space pen, cost millions. They came up with a pencil, and for redundancy, they had a second one. So again, as we're looking at firm fixed pricing and predictability of time, should we in fact push NASA to accomplish the mission with the highest level of reuse of technology, or should we allow them to continue to say, but we're exploring all kinds of new technology which inherently brings in at least in my examination, it brings in risk assessment of new technology. One only needs to look at the Boeing MAX and ask the question, is there anything that new about a 737 going 34,000 feet? No, but somehow every change is a variable. So if we're looking to deliver on time, on budget, are we doing all the right things, or are we doing all the things that have led us to this inevitable delay and cost overrun?
Great question. I think that's as I see it, NASA's at an inflection point right now because they are about to set the agency baseline commitments for a number of these efforts. And you referred to the firm fixed price contracts and things, and once you settle on a number that is great, you can hold the contractor to that price, that deliverable. But it's up to the government to have stable requirements, right? When you change those requirements, then that changes the deal that you have with the contractor that could cost additional funds. So right now, what we expect to see really then.
Contract changes are where all the profit is, isn't it?
Right, that equals dollars. If it's a cost-plus contract, if there's a delay, you're paying the contractor's cost plus whatever fee goes along with that. So I think as we look to these new efforts, how those technical and cost baselines are set and the realism of those are going to be very important. And we'll see in the coming 12 to 18 months whether the projects can adhere to those baselines, meet the technical challenges. There's going to be some margin for cost and schedule reserves to deal with issues, but the fidelity and the realism of those baselines will be extremely important for what are some new and novel technologies.
This hearing is adjourned.